Hello, everyone. This is going to be a larger topic, and it's going to be the basis for a larger project coming later this week. This is a pretty important thing in ecosystems, and it's what we're going to talk about today. And this is succession. So, succession can be defined as the progressive change of an environment or an ecosystem over time. It can be broken down into two different categories of succession. So, these are primary and secondary succession. Primary succession refers to the beginning stages of an ecosystem's development where exposed rock or soil is colonized by living things for the first time. So the important thing about primary succession, it's an area, first time living things are there. Secondary succession is when an ecosystem is disturbed or disrupted and then recolonized after the disturbance, such as a wildfire. Succession is a process where an ecosystem comes into beings. So we talked about population and communities, and then ecosystem. So ecosystem being the biotic and abiotic, so living and non-living parts of a given area, such as a forest or an ocean or a river, etc. Succession is that process of that coming into being. It's the way that the communities change over time and everything comes together to work into one big place. So we're going to start off by giving an example of primary succession. So here's two examples of what could be primary succession. So we have a volcano erupting and the lava forming new earth, as well as we have a glacier melting or shifting off of rock that's never had anything living there before, and it's creating new earth for an ability to live. There could also be an earthquake, a seismic shift, a tidal wave washing off an island, anywhere where there was never life here to begin with, or it was an abiotic situation where there's no life, just blank rock, new rock forming. It's a brand new space for an ecosystem to be created, and that's where primary succession comes into play. Secondary succession happens when there was already an ecosystem or life there to begin with, and some disturbance or big shift happens to get rid of that ecosystem. So examples could be a wildfire burning down a forest. You could have a flood that drowns a grassland and now it's marshy or it needs to grow everything over again. You could have a lush green jungle that has had a strip mine put into the middle of it, and there's nothing, everything's been taken down, there's nothing there left, and now the jungle begins to retake the space. So this is the process of secondary succession. There was something there before, something happened to get rid of it, and then the ecosystem comes back. So how does succession happen? So succession generally starts very slow. The first communities have very little species diversity. So this means that there may only be a few different types of living things in the area. So if we think back to when we were talking about population and communities and stuff, communities are multiple different species living together. So this could be some insects, some wild grasses, wildfires, some mice, some microorganisms. As many of these living things in one area, that's our community. If you think back of our levels of organization, we had a few fish, we had some seaweed, we had some crabs. So it's a groups of animals or living things. It doesn't have to be just animals, it could also be plants in one area. So with succession, it generally starts with a small community. So the community has very little species diversity. There may only be one species in the area, or maybe two, maybe one wild grass, and then one kind of insect that maybe eats those seeds. And that's how it starts. Succession is in this very base stage, and then slowly more and more move in. So in primary succession, if we go back to that picture from before, where there's nothing growing to begin with in primary succession, that first species that moves in is called the pioneer species. So this is generally a plant of some kind, and it comes in and it helps to break down the rock, and create soil, and create a place suitable for other plant life. As these plants die off, they decompose, they return their nutrients to the soil, as well as their roots, and through their living, they break down the rock, they keep good soil, good stuff from blowing away, from about being wiped away, and they create a more suitable area, a more suitable area of growth, more suitable soil, so that a bigger ecosystem can build off of that spot. As more and more species move in, the area becomes more diverse, and also this ecosystem becomes more unsuitable or worse, more bad for the original pioneer species. So then that species begins to die off and move out, leaving behind this changed ecosystem. So often you don't see the primary species sticking around to the very end. You'll see it grow. Maybe there's this flowering plant that grows for a little while, then bigger shrubs come in, and some trees come in, and that plant, the first plant that you'll have seen, will go away. So it'll live there for a time being, but then the ecosystem will have changed around it, and it'll go away. Through all of this, primary succession can take hundreds or thousands of years to complete. This is a very slow process, especially of new life in an area that's never had it before. It's very hard to get that area, that place, suitable for a really diverse ecosystem. So primary succession is also not super common. More commonly, we will see secondary succession. So the example we're going to use is going to be this climax forest or this climax ecosystem. So the climax means the finish, the very last thing. So in this case, if we have this old growth forest with a lot of big, large, old trees, some nice shrubs, very diverse animal life, lots of organisms living here, that will be the final stage of our ecosystem. So thinking back about secondary succession happens when a disturbance occurs. So in this case, we have a wildfire. So a fire comes in, it burns down our entire forest, leaves nothing left. If you see the second stage there, it's just a burnt out log, there's ash on the ground, there's nothing left living in the area. The fire wiped everything out. The first thing that will come into play is you'll have microorganisms and small algae and things like that begin to grow in the soil. There's a lot of nutrients left in the soil as all those things that were burnt down still had their nutrients contained inside them. So if you have these microorganisms and these small plants that work to further break down those nutrients and release them back into the soil, you now have a place that's really suitable for new life. However, you still need those plants to move in. So the second thing to happen after those first microorganisms come in is you'll have small grasses and small plants start to take form and grow in this area. So if you look at that third picture there, that's the small grasses, those small things begin to move in, begin to decompose, begin to create a better place for life further on and for more diverse ecosystem. As these grasses move in, there'll also be things that maybe eat these grasses, such as mice or voles, or things like rabbits and foxes that will also be coming into this area and begin populating with different species. After some time, some small trees and some shrubs, larger shrubs, will begin to grow, and they'll fill more and more niches as niches are created. So let's talk about niches for a second. A niche is just referring to a place in an ecosystem that a certain organism is perfect to fill. So for example, in our forest, we have lots of grasses with seeds. Mice and rabbits may move in and eat those seeds and grass. However, if we only had mice and rabbits, the grass would soon be overrun and they'd all be eaten off because of how many mice and rabbits we have there. In this case, we have a niche for a small carnivore, something that will eat those rabbits and eat those mice and catch them and keep that population down. So this niche would be filled by a fox. However, we can't have too many foxes, or we can't have like foxes and wolves and cougars and lynxes all in the area, because then they would eat all the rabbits and mice. However, we have a small niche for one organism. So in that case, that niche can be filled for the fox. Maybe we have something that comes in and eats the fox, or runs something that is bigger off the land, but that would be a different niche. So each niche is just a place where an organism perfectly fits in an ecosystem. If you think about it like a school, we have many different teachers teaching different grades. Each niche would be the specific teacher for that grade. So you don't have like all kindergarten teachers teaching every grade, because that may not be their specialty. However, you have kindergarten teachers and grade 2, 3 teachers and so forth, a principal, a librarian, etc. You have people that are filling those specific roles in a school or in a job, so that the organization can function. And the larger the thing, the larger the ecosystem, the larger the organization. Say you have a really big company like Microsoft or Google, there's going to be a lot of different jobs for people in those companies. You're going to have programmers and bosses and stuff like that, because they're going to have a lot more niches. So the larger an ecosystem, just like a large company, will have a large diversity, so a lot of different jobs in a lot of different places or niches for animals and organisms to fill. Okay, now going back to succession. So if we look at our pictures here, we had the large wildfire, the big trees burnt down. We had microorganisms growing in the second picture. The third picture, we have some grasses and some small rodents. Fourth picture, more grasses, a little small trees, and some shrubs and stuff like that. And eventually, we're going to have larger and older trees keep moving in and grow, and we're going to go back to that same first picture, albeit without the fire. So going back to talk a little bit more about trees in the last stage of succession. On the left, we have a picture of aspen or poplar, and these are a younger tree. So after those shrubs and those grasses are there, these are probably going to be the trees in a given area that you would see growing and shooting up. They grow pretty quickly, they grow very fast, they reproduce very quickly, so you're going to see a lot of them in an area very quickly. However, they also aren't very strong. So strong winds, big storms, stuff like that can break them and knock them down pretty quickly. So if you're thinking about one of those later stages of succession, you're probably going to have some of those aspen coming in as your first young trees. So young trees are great because they They add to an area, they provide shade, they shape the ecosystem. However, after a while, they get pushed out by the older trees. So on the right, we have a picture of oak forest. So a typical thing that you may see in Manitoba is you'll have a poplar forest change into an oak forest. So if you think behind LaSalle School, or behind kind of where that church is, there's that little bit of that brush area, that forested area. There's actually quite a few oak trees in there as well as some poplars. And something like that, if that was left as a forest, it would be moving from this poplar forest to this oak forest. Because as you move, the younger poplar forest or the weaker poplar forest will get knocked down, and the trees on the right, these older growth trees, are more hardy. So they're able to withstand more environmental pressures. They're able to withstand flooding a bit better, or big snowstorms or big rainstorms. And even though they grow a lot slower, because oak trees grow very slowly, they can also live a long time. So they have a long life expectancy. So oftentimes you'll see one of these older forests, this apex or this climactic, the last stage of a forest we'll see them as this old growth oak forest or something like that, something where they have a really old tree that's come into play. So there's a lot of different types of these strong older trees. You can have like the redwoods and the sequoias in the forest along the west coast of British Columbia, as well as the northern states like in Washington and Portland, or like Seattle area, stuff in there. Oregon, you'll have a lot of these large redwood trees and stuff like that. Also in the Rocky Mountains, you'll have lots of large pine forests where the pine are the older tree and they're the strong tree. As well as in northern Manitoba, you also find a lot of these pine forests. However, an ecosystem generally doesn't have more than one or two of these strong old tree species. Just like a big organization or a job doesn't have multiple bosses, there's usually only the niche or the place to fit one or two of these larger species, because they do about the same thing, they compete for the same resources, etc. So finally, we're going to say that secondary succession can take anywhere from 50 to 100 years to occur, and this one happens a lot. And this is the one that we're going to move into our project on doing. We're going to talk about this kind of succession. So thank you for watching. Let me know if you have any questions.